This is another iRaw podcast. We podcast to make the world a better place for animals.
Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals. Dr. Siobhan O'Sullivan does like knowing animals.
Hello everyone, and welcome to Knowing Animals. Knowing Animals is a podcast in which we speak to animal studies scholars about a piece of their work. I'm Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals. This episode of Knowing Animals is brought to you by ASA, that's AASA, the Australasian Animal Studies Association. You can join ASA for just $60 Australian if you're a waged academic, and there's a concession rate of $15 Australian. You can also follow them on social media. Just this morning, I was taking a look through their website and noticed that they invite guest contributors to submit to their blog. So if you might be interested in blogging for the Australian Animal Studies Association about a topic in animal studies, do consider getting in touch with them. This episode is also brought to you by the Animal Publics book series from Sydney University Press. This is a regularly updated collection of scholarly books about animal studies. And one thing that's worth mentioning is that they're actually very reasonably priced. Academic books, rightly I might add, have a reputation for being expensive, but the Animal Publics books are quite accessible price-wise. And as regular listeners will know, we have some forthcoming episodes about books in the Animal Publics book series with Siobhan O'Sullivan. And Siobhan, as I'm sure all of you will know, was the founding host of Knowing Animals. Today I'm very pleased to introduce you to Dr Eva Meijer. Eva is a philosopher who is, at the time of recording, a postdoctoral researcher at Wageningen University and Research, though she will soon be beginning a research fellowship at the University of Amsterdam entitled The Politics of Not Eating Animals. She's also an accomplished musician, visual artist, and author of popular fiction and popular non-fiction. She's published 10 books, which have been translated into 18 languages. Her books available in English include the novel Bird Cottage and the non-fiction books Animal Languages, The Secret Conversations of the Living World, and The Limits of My Language, Meditations on Depression. Today, however, we're going to talk about her academic monograph, When Animals Speak, Toward an Interspecies Democracy, which was published in 2019 by NYU Press as the first book in their Animals in Context series. Welcome to the podcast, Eva.
Thank you, Josh.
So can you start by telling us what inspired you to write about this topic?
When I began to study philosophy, I was already quite interested in finding out more about our obligations towards non-human animals. And I was sort of hoping to understand my own intuitions better because they did not really align with the intuitions of most other humans. But when you begin to study philosophy, there's a couple of things you notice. First of all, it's mostly male philosophers that you read, which was interesting to me because I came from art school and there was already a whole discussion about feminism and equal representation. And at the University of Amsterdam at the time, it wasn't completely there yet in that way. So that was one of the things. But also, you soon notice that philosophy is mostly a matter of humans thinking about humans. But of course, there were also some courses about environmental ethics that included some animal rights literature, Peter Singer's texts, and also Tom Regan's texts, so the kind of very basic animal rights stuff. But what I noticed was that these texts were mostly still in the framework of human beings thinking about other animals as a kind of static being, as an object. And one of the things I had learned from experience, for example, from living with dogs and horses and cats, was that they too are expressive beings who shape human-animal relationships, who influenced my life and my being. And I didn't really see that in that literature at the moment. So I began to read more and more and more and more and more. And at the time, the book Zoopolis came out when I was writing my master's thesis about political conversations with other animals. And that was, of course, a very influential book and a new way of thinking about our relationships with other animals, but I still kind of felt like we weren't thinking about language and communication and interaction. So I began to focus on that. And an interesting thing is that my father had always been sending me newspaper clippings about empirical research concerning animal cultures, animal languages, all of these things. So I had this archive, this newspaper clipping archive of animal stories, and I decided to take seriously the research on language, and that was sort of the beginning of my PhD research, which was at the basis of the book When Animals Speak, Toward an Interspecies Democracy. So it came out of the feeling that there was something lacking in the field, that we weren't thinking about language enough, and the understanding that this was a political question in itself. Because whether or not other animals speak is not simply a question of empirical research that investigates this in relation to human language, but it's also a matter of which voices count, which types of expression are taken seriously.
So, should we start with this idea of language and then move on to the politics a little later? Because that's how you do it in the book. Core to your project is the idea that we can speak with animals and that animals have languages. Could you explain what you mean by the idea of animals having languages?
Well, on a very basic level, beings of different species, social beings of different species, have ways of speaking to one another. I mean, you're gonna have to, whether it's about hunting or finding a partner or, I don't know, speaking about humans as a form of danger. For example, elephants do that. They have a sound or word for human, and they also distinguish between white humans and black humans. And then their word for white human also means danger. But many animals speak about humans. Whales speak about humans. Prairie dogs, of course, speak about humans. Bats speak about humans. So, what do I mean with animals having languages? So, there are species specific forms of communication that evolve differently in different species. So, we use words and sounds and body language even. When I'm talking to you now and we can't see each other, I'm using my hands to sort of, I don't know, say something to you. You can't even see it, but maybe you feel it in my voice. But there are also a lot of very situated and specific forms of language and interaction and communication between beings of different species. So there's literature on humans and dogs, or humans and horses, or chickens and humans, that shows that these beings of different species understand each other. Because very often when we speak about animals and language, there's kind of this skepticism about animal minds and the idea that we can never fully grasp what they are saying because they speak in languages that are perhaps different from human language. And of course, all these different beings have their own ways of being in the world. So some animals communicate by using colors or through gestures, bodily movements, eye contact. There are many different ways in which they communicate, and these can be quite complex. In fact, there are quite a lot of things we do not know yet about the languages of other animals because we didn't investigate them as such. Most studies about animal language are from the last 10 or 15 years. So it's become quite a field, but it's still sort of, because there was for a long time this prejudice that animals did not speak. There was no or very little research on the ways that they do speak. So to get back to your question, of course, the question is perhaps not, or the philosophical question is not, do animals have languages? But what do we mean when we speak about language in relation to non-human animals? And this is also why I said before that it's a political question. We tend to use human language as a blueprint to investigate whether or not other animals have language. But I'd like to turn the question around and begin with this multiplicity of forms of communication and this whole wide world of understanding and misunderstandings. And then again, ask the question of what language really is. And I mean, that's what's happening in philosophy of language. And philosophers don't agree. There are some people who think that we are all born with a universal grammar inside of us, like Chomsky. There are also very different approaches, like, for example, Wittgenstein's idea of language, which is much more rooted in social practices. Asking the question whether or not other animals have languages is valuable in itself, because on the one hand it asks us to look at other animals in a different way. I mean, it presents you with a different vocabulary, but I guess it also again sheds light on the question of what language actually is. In that sense, it's similar, I think, to what has been called a political turn in animal philosophy. So for a long time people only thought about animals in ethics, and now also in political philosophy. And one of the great advantages is that we are considering many concepts that we weren't considering before when thinking about other animals, like democracy or citizenship. And that shed light on our obligations and their rights and our rights and all of these things. It basically enables us to see them differently. And I think that's one of the basic things that philosophy can do. It can show us the world in a different light, and in that sense also connect to social and political issues.
Given those kind of methodological reflections there about turning the question of language around, perhaps my next question is in some sense mistaken, but what I was going to ask was, which animals do you think have language? And the specific reason I ask that is that one chapter in the book that I know has generated a bit of discussion is called Worm Politics. So do you think that worms have language, for example?
I think we don't know. I think people haven't researched that in a very decent way. And so, in part, it's always an empirical question. And empirically, we do not have enough data for many, many, many species to answer your question. And even for some species that we know that have quite elaborate languages, like dolphins or bats, we only found that out quite recently through the use of technology. So it's changing fast and a lot is happening. So that is one part of the question. There's a lot we don't know. Another part of the question is, who am I as a human being, as someone who has been thinking about this and who discusses it with other humans? I'm not in a position to decide what is meaningful communication for someone else. I am perhaps in a position to say something about what I think is language. And in that sense, I'm in the privileged position of also writing novels, for example, in which language functions very differently, for example, from academic texts. So I like to move between different registers. I'm also a musician, so that's also, in a sense, a language beyond language. And I think that if we are going to answer your question, we have to be really specific. So there's, for example, a lot of new research about animal morality. Kristen Andrews is working on that, and Susanna Monzo and others. And what I like about their approach is that they kind of take the question of empirical research and philosophy in tandem. So on the one hand, they do new types of research that is kind of based on the idea that animals are not black boxes, but actual responsive beings that are capable of things. And on the other hand, they reinterpret concepts. And I think that for language, we sort of need the same thing. So it's a matter of question and response. And ideally, we would be investigating all of these questions together with the non-human animals.
Now, that's interesting, this idea of investigating with non human animals, because one of the concepts that plays a big part in your argument is this idea of a shared world with non human animals. And so we can create these shared worlds through communicating. Could you explain what you mean by that?
Philosophically, it's connected to the phenomenological idea of world as a common shared life world that functions as a shell that holds us together, and language is in that life world the thing through which we express ourselves, but that also forms us. And with language, we form the world, but also we are also formed by the language that the world gives us. So, who we are as human beings is, for a large part, connected to speaking about who we are. We are meaning creating beings, and through creating meanings, we establish common worlds with others. Now, traditionally, for example, in the work of Heidegger, these others were only humans because language was seen as something that only humans were capable of and had a close connection to human rationality as well. But of course, we know that humans and other animals also share households and habitats, territories, share lives, work together, care for one another. And these relationships form both the non human animals in question and also the humans, even if they are not aware of that. But also, I think in many ways, humans who share their lives with other animals are very aware of that, even when they feel a little bit ashamed about it or something. So, this idea of sharing life worlds with others is not something that is limited to humans. And what I am arguing is that in these human, non human animal relations, in these interspecies households and interspecies communities, there's a lot of meaning making going on through communication and language between beings of different species. And in that sense, doing justice to animal languages, to the ways that they express themselves, also enables the human in the relationship to, or enables maybe the human and the other animal to create a world that is bigger or more elaborate, has more options for freedom and choice and expressions. Thinking about language also asks us to listen to animals in different ways on an individual level, but also as a society, because we are very, as humans, we're very used to always being the one who decides what is good and just. But we know that a lot of our knowledge of other animals is based on stereotypical views of them. And thinking about sharing life worlds with animals, so not just simply inhabiting the same material geographical territories, but also these more symbolic worlds, asks us to be attentive to them in new ways. And the nice thing, or the moving but also sometimes tragic thing, is that many non-human animals are quite open to conversation, even if we don't deserve it as humans. But that is also a ground for hope.
Yes. Now, this leads us very conveniently to the political questions that you address in the latter half of the book. So, how do you think that taking this fact of animal language and human animal communication seriously, how do you think that that will impact our politics, or how do you think that it should impact our politics, perhaps?
So, on the one hand, you find that animal agency already influences a human society. So, it's never a fact of all or nothing. It's even now when we think that as humans we're kind of on top of everything and arranging everything, many of our practices are already formed by animal acts and animal behaviors. Dinesh Wadiwell, for example, writes about a fish hook that already is kind of shaped in a way that is formed by a fish's resistance. And there are many other examples. So I think that doing multi species politics in a more just way, which is important for democratic reasons of justice, begins with acknowledging the fact that they are here, they act, they influence policies. And in When Animals Speak, I discuss several case studies. I, for example, write about geese who came into the Netherlands on our invitation because they were actually sought out as architects of a certain nature reserve, the Oostvaardersplassen, because they were eating all the young trees so that it wouldn't overgrow, which is now a problem actually for this nature reserve, but that's a whole different story. But of course, when you invite birds, then very often at a certain point there are a lot of them, especially with the way that the Netherlands looks. We have a lot of meadows with nice grass for them, and we have a lot of suburbs that are suitable for them. So we now have many geese. And what the Dutch then do is kill them, because that's the usual solution for Dutch people when they have a problem with non-human animals. They will shoot them. But the problem, there are, of course, many problems. It's very problematic to shoot them in the first place. We should never do that. But the problem for the Dutch, in their opinion, is that it doesn't work because geese fly. And when you keep the land intact, you're actually going to attract more and more geese. But what is interesting about the case study of the geese is that there's actually a lot of deliberation going on between different parties. So farmers are communicating with geese, hunters are communicating with geese, city officials are communicating with geese, politicians are communicating with farmers, hunters, etc. So these different groups all have ways of interacting with one another, and most of that is taken seriously, but not the communication with the geese. And there lies actually the key for doing it in a better way, in a more just way, which of course begins with accepting their presence. But it also includes some communication, because they might land in places that are not suitable for them, that are close to roads or dangerous or something. And there are already people using methods to communicate with the geese that are more in line with standards for normal deliberation. So farmers know that there are certain ways of planting seeds that communicate to the geese that they're not wanted because they can't eat it, or they track them to another field and then the geese go there, and then there's also a sort of a better solution. So by framing this as a form of political deliberation, you change the view of the situation and also the view that people have of the geese. By then taking the communication with them seriously as communication, and geese are they're very good at reading humans individually, and they have a very good view of the land as well. So they're a fairly easy species to communicate with about these issues. So by taking this seriously as a form of political deliberation, it would not only improve the lives of the geese, but also make the situation better for everyone, I think. So that's kind of an example of how we could reformulate political relations with other animals by being attentive to how they perceive their surroundings, how they communicate, how they interact.
That's fascinating. I have a final related question. How do you think that taking the voices, the language of animals seriously might change animal activism?
I think that a lot of animal activism is already based on highlighting non-human animal individuality in some sense. But it's also, yeah, I mean, there are different answers to this question, I think, because on the one hand, drawing attention to the fact that non-human animals speak, that they act politically, already changes humans' opinions about them. So it shows the world in a different light. It makes you, I mean, for me, the research changed me. When I walk out of my door, I feel surrounded by all of these communities of non-human animals who are living their lives and communicating with each other. And there are the sparrows in the hedge that are discussing things in the morning, and the pigeons who are asking me something, mostly food. And then, of course, there are the animals that I live with myself. So this idea that animals speak, that they act politically, changes people's minds and hearts, hopefully. Activists could be in their activism more aware of the fact that other animals also have a perspective on our shared future, but that also complicates activism in a sense, right? Because it also asks that we not only highlight injustices, but that we actively engage with other animals in trying to find better ways of living together. And there's a lot that we do not know about it. I mean, of course, activism very often focuses on the very basic issues of animal suffering. And it's pretty clear that they do not desire suffering, and you don't need language and difficult things to speak about that. But I do think that in a sense, it also makes things more difficult. But then again, very often things have to become more difficult before they become more clear. And it's fun as well. A lot of us activists are, of course, quite aware of the violence that is done to non-human animals on a daily basis. And that can be really devastating to be aware of that. So it's also nice to know about the good things that happen in their lives. And I think that the animal language research also shows us about that, the way that they develop dances together. For example, albatrosses that go to a certain site and go there every year when they are young, dance with different partners, then find one partner, then they continue going there every year and they develop this dance. And then at a certain point they think, okay, we are going to stay together for the rest of our lives, and they live somewhere, and then they spend most of the year not together, and when they meet they still dance their special dance. That's just really beautiful, and it's an honor to share the world with all of these beings, and sometimes the world is beautiful.
Now, that's a great thought to end our main conversation on. We ask every guest on Knowing Animals 5 quick questions. Are you ready for your 5 quick questions?
Yes.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever read?
Well, that would be a book by Charlotte Mutsaers, who is a Dutch writer who writes beautiful essays about humans and other animals. And she completely denies human supremacy in her work in a very playful and beautiful way.
Can you recall the first piece of pro-animal scholarship you ever wrote?
Well, the first academic piece was probably a student essay on Iris Marianne Young's work and non-human animals.
And if you had to name one animal studies scholar who's had a big impact on you, who would it be?
This is a difficult question because I feel that all of my beautiful and wonderful colleagues inspire me, but I think the work of Sue Donaldson is probably most important or has the biggest impact on my own writing.
And what do you think is the most important thing that academics can do for animals?
Well, I think it's actually 3 things. So, on the one hand, we have to do the research in order to know what we are even talking about and to radicalize the field of philosophy, in my case, and your case as well. Secondly, and relatedly, it's really also about establishing a community of scholars and creating spaces in universities for doing that research. I mean, we still have to fight for the field to be taken seriously. And thirdly, I think it's very important that we translate our insights to larger society so that we do not only write academic texts, but also write texts for a larger audience, because the topics are simply too important not to do this.
And you're doing quite a lot of public philosophy in the Netherlands at the moment, aren't you?
Yeah. And I feel that it's a duty, but I also feel that that a lot of people want to know more about our relations with other animals, because a lot of people feel that there are things that are very, very wrong with these, but simply they don't really know how to think about it. They don't know about all of this wonderful research that people are doing at the moment. And I think it's very helpful for them to think about it in a philosophical sense, because it presents them with a different lens to think about these things.
If you had the power to change one thing about the human-non-human animal relationship, what would it be?
Well, it would be interesting to reverse the power relation. So maybe just for a couple of weeks and see where we ended up.
Yes, fascinating. That's not an answer I've heard before. Very good. What are you working on next?
Well, you already mentioned in the introduction that I got some VENI funding from the Dutch government to do research about the politics of eating or not eating animals. Very often, eating animals is still framed as an ethical question or a lifestyle question or something that you can just decide to do or not to do, while in many ways it is, of course, political, because other animals are political beings and our relations with them are political, but also because the way that we consume impacts other humans in different parts of the world. And also because eating animals is very often intertwined with other forms of oppression. So I will be investigating that again through the lens of justice and language and deliberation, and also by looking at the questions about voice and silencing that we were discussing before. And hopefully this will also lead to a book project about dialogues with others. In philosophy, the dialogue is kind of it began with dialogues with Socrates, of course, but in Socrates' dialogues, there's one person knowing everything. And I think that resembles how we think about humans. So I would be interested to find out how we can enter dialogues with those who are different from us and what that means for knowledge and truth. So that's kind of the larger project in the back of my mind that I'm working on.
That's fascinating. How can people find out more about your work?
I have a website, and people can find that at www.evameijer.nl. And there's a lot of stuff on there about publications, and there's a picture of me playing ukulele with my dog Pika in front of me, and there's music and other things, so people can go there.
Well, thanks so much for joining us for Knowing Animals, Eva.
Thank you, Josh, for this conversation.
And thank you, listeners, for joining us for Knowing Animals, the podcast where we talk to animal studies scholars about their work. Don't forget to follow us on Twitter at knowing_animals or on Facebook at Knowing Animals. You can also follow me on Twitter at Josh L. Milburn or on Instagram at A Vegan Philosopher. Also, don't forget to tell others about us and to review the podcast where you found it. Reviews make it easier for others to find us. I'm Josh Milburn, and I do like knowing animals.
For more great iRaw podcasts, visit irawpod.com. That's IROARPOD.com.